So we're getting started with defining this effect. We're filtering for specific actions. But of course, the question is, what do we want to do with these actions then? Or with the action that we are reacting to. So in this case, to the login start action. Well, the login start action should yield us some specific information that we need for logging in. For that, we need to create a new action class here in the auth actions file. The login start class, which also implements action. That, of course, has our read-only type, login, which is login start. But it also needs a payload, because for logging in, we need what? Well, an email and a password. That is what we currently use in the auth service for login. Here, if you check login, we get email and a password. So in the auth actions, here I also expect to have a payload, which essentially is of type object, where we have an email key, which is a string, and a password key, which is a string. So this is how such an action should look like. With that defined here, we can go back to the auth effects and now add another RxJS operator as a second step. First step is that we're filtering. Next step now can be a switch map, which allows us, which is imported from RxJS operators, which allows us to create a new observable by taking another observable's data. So here we get our auth data, and we know, since we're filtering for the login start action, that the type of this will be auth actions login start, now referring to the class. So this is our type of data, and in switch map, we now can return a new observable. And the new observable I want to return here, of course, uses the Angular HTTP client to send our login request. So just what we previously did in the login function, our service. So we can actually copy this entire code snippet here from the login method here in the auth service and add it to auth effects in this switch map here. Now, important though, this of course requires us to inject the HTTP service. We also need to get access to the auth response data interface, to the environment constant for getting our Firebase API key, and we need to extract email and password. Now let's start with extracting email and password, because that is of course part of our auth data payload. So here we can just access auth data, payload, email, and auth data, payload, password. Next, let's inject the Angular HTTP client. So let's go down to the constructor and call private or add private HTTP and refer to the HTTP client imported from @Angular comment HTTP. Let's also get access to the environment constant here, which we can find in our environments, one level up, in our environments folder and there in the environment file. And regarding the auth response data, that's an interface I'm defining in the auth service. Let's actually copy it from there, not remove it there right now because we still need it for signing up. We will remove it in the future. And let's move it over to auth effects as well. So now we have our auth effect for logging in, but this effect won't work for a couple of reasons actually. First of all, an effect by default always should return a new action at the end once it's done, because this effect itself doesn't change the state, right? It just executes some code. Nowhere do we touch our reducer or our NGRX state, and that's how it should be. But typically, once an effect is done, you want to edit the state, and that's the same here for logging in. Once we did log in, if we did succeed, I of course want to dispatch my login action so that the reducer can take over and create that user object. So therefore, we need to return a new action here at the end of our action of our effects chain here. And in addition, we also need to add a special decorator to this auth login property here to turn it into an effect NGRX effects is able to pick up later. That is the add effect decorator. And effect simply is imported from @ngrx/effects. This is required for NGRX effects to pick up this property as an effect. So basically, as an effect it wants to handle, it wants to subscribe to, and so on. And the next step, as I mentioned, is of course then also that we return a new action here at the end. And since we're in an observable chain, returning a new action simply means that we have to return a new observable. Now, of course, I only want to log the user in if we haven't gotten an error from this HTTP request, right? That's the same logic here in the auth service for logging in. There, we send this request, we catch errors to handle errors, and only if we get no error, we continue here, and then we handle the authentication. I want to do the same here with auth effects, but the logic has to be a bit different. It's important to understand that an observable completes whenever an error is thrown. Therefore, in the auth service, whenever this here yields an error, catch error kicks in, and this code never executes, and this entire observable dies, which is no problem because when we call login again, a new observable is created. Now, it's a bit differently for effects. Effects here, this is an ongoing observable stream. This must never die, at least not as long as our application is running. And therefore, if we would catch an error here by adding catch error here as a next step after switch map, which we could do because switch map returns an HTTP observable, and this could certainly throw an error. If we add the catch error like this, or even if we don't add it, if this throws an error, this entire observable stream will die, which means that trying to log in again will simply not work because this here will never react to another dispatched login start event because this entire observable is dead. And therefore, errors have to be handled on a different level. Here, we're creating a new observable, and with switch map, I'm returning that new observable here, right? We can call pipe on that inner observable too. Previously, we haven't done this, but now we need to do it here. This allows us to add operators on this inner observable, not on the overall observable chain. And here we can now pipe catch error, which you need to import, by the way, from RxJS operators, and also pipe map, which will execute if we have no error. And that also needs to be imported from RxJS operators. Now, catch error, of course, receives any error we might be getting. And now here we can run our error handling code. But most importantly, and that is super important to understand, here we have to return a non-error observable so that our overall stream doesn't die. And since switch map returns the result of this inner observable stream as a new observable to the outer chain here, returning a non-error observable in catch error is crucial so that this erroneous observable in here still yields a non-error observable, which is picked up by switch map and which is then returned to this overall stream, to this overall observable chain. So in here, I will therefore use auth, which is imported from RxJS, which is simply a utility function for creating a new observable without an error. I will call auth in here to return a new observable. Now, the same inside of map. This by default wouldn't have an error, but of course here we also must not create an error. We instead have to return a non-erroneous observable here as well. Now here inside of map, what do I expect? Let's have a look at the auth service. We should get our response data here. And therefore, let's go back to auth effects. We get response data. And ultimately here, I also want to use auth to create a new observable. The question now just is, what should be inside of these new observables we're creating here?